few weeks ago, I made my deep dive exploration magnum opus. Oh my God, I hope not. Like, if that's my magnum opus, like, and that's the best thing I'm ever going to create, I'm going to quit right now. Right now. A few weeks ago, I made my deep dive into the world of the literary it girl and associated thought daughter social media tropes describing intellectual young women. And I thought, hey, I'm an intellectual young woman. Why don't I talk about the books I like? Shall I? Why not? Why not? Why not? Yeah, I also, look, I've got books. I've got books all around me. Clearly, I know what I'm talking about, right? Without further ado, let's get started with my book that I wish I had written. Now, to give some context to this, I really love a good coming of age story. Like, I love that concept of finding your way in the world, developing into the person you're going to become. And I also love a book that incorporates a good degree of philosophy into fiction. And so, book I wish I had written is Either Or by Elif Batuman. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I don't speak Turkish, but it seems like a reasonable approximation of what her name might be pronounced as. This book follows a young Harvard student in her first year. I believe she's in her first year still in this one. I think I think she is. Now I'm getting confused. I think she's still in her first year. I think this is like the second semester of her first year, if I'm remembering correctly. I should have maybe done my research a bit more on this. Maybe I'm not an intellectual. But it follows the second semester of her first year at Harvard, or maybe her second year at Harvard. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. It's early on in her Harvard education, and she is actively finding her way in the world. Now, this is a companion novel to the potentially more, I think, book talk famous The Idiot. And now I also read and really enjoyed The Idiot. This is following the same character in her first year at Harvard. This one follows really her story of having her first kind of all-encompassing relationship and following a guy halfway around the world to explore whether that's going to be a thing. I've been there many times, like sometimes to disastrous consequences, so I related to that quite heavily. And when I finished reading The Idiot, I was like, oh, I want to inhabit this world a little longer. And then conveniently enough, there is a companion novel with the same characters following a lot of the same kind of coming of age, developing into a person themes. Now, what gives Either Or, though, the slight edge for me is that it's one of those books where, like, it's really using philosophy to, like, tell the story. It's kind of asking broader questions about the nature of life and reality and how we become ourselves and how we make decisions. And it does this very appealing thing to me, which is that the main character kind of uses a text, a philosophical text to ground her decisions in life. And I love this idea of using like a form of media to like shape the way your reality looks for a little while. Like, I like the idea of using a fiction book to shape the way your reality looks. I like the idea of using, I don't know, an album to shape the way your reality looks for a while. I just think it's a very compelling idea. It's enthralling to me. And so she uses as her grounding text a book that I then also bought as a result, Kierkegaard's Either Or, book of the same title as the novel. And I haven't read that yet because it's quite like, it's like dense philosophy and I just have not had time to really like get stuck into that. But I probably will going forward as I hopefully claw back more time in my life. And maybe it too will become my grounding text for this second adolescence I seem to be going through. And so that's what I liked about Either Or. And I just think fun coming of age novels, philosophical orientation, finding your way in the world through literature and thought. Oh, I'm here for it. Now, our next book on my list, I don't actually have my visual aid physical copy with me to also prove that, hey, I own books. Wow, wow, wow. My husband's reading it right now, so he took my copy and I believe he has it at work with him to read on the commute. So I don't have it, but that book is, it's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I know this book has been talked about a lot. I know a lot of people have read it. It's really famous. It's been on all these bestseller lists. And this, though, is a book that I feel expanded my perspective on life. Okay, so Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, when it came out, I noticed it. I saw the title, I saw the cover. I was really intrigued from the very start. I'm like, ooh, that looks like something I might want to read. And then I found out it's about video games. And I'm like, maybe not. Maybe not. Because I'm like not a gamer in the slightest. I think 3 games. I like The Sims. I like Civilization, but only Civ 2, because I don't like the later versions where it gets all like graphically fancy and stuff. I like the experience of moving my little animated figures around a map and creating my own civilization, conquering other cities, et cetera, et cetera. And then relatedly, I like a game called Caesar 3, where you are effectively a Roman emperor building your Roman city. So those are the only 3 games I like. I'm not a gamer, and I've not even played those games in like several years. So like, I'm just really not a gamer, you know what I mean? So I thought, did I want to read a book about gamers? Not really. Not really. And then I picked it up. And when I was at the bookshop, the woman who checked me out said, oh, like, I think you're going to love this. She doesn't know me at all, but anyway, she said, oh yeah, like it's about games. Maybe she could just look at me and tell that like, I'm not a gamer girl, but I am like a books girl. And she's like, oh, I think you're really going to love this. It's like, it's not really about games. And I'm like, okay, that's promising. It's promising. And so I started reading it, and indeed it did shift my perspectives. Now, first of all, it's a beautiful story. It's one of the nicest stories I think I've read all year. It's a story of friendship. It's a story about love, but like not romantic love. It's a story of the love that exists between 2 friends. But also, it being a book about gaming actually turned out to be an angle that I loved. And here's why. So this book follows these 2 friends in their platonic love relationship, and it's a story of them developing games together. And it just like changed my perspective on like the artistry that goes into game development. Like, I did not know actually how much goes into it, like how you have to think through the storyline and the visuals and the music and the way the characters develop and what they experience. And I'm like, oh wow, so it's like, wait, like, is developing a game kind of just like writing a novel? Like, oh, that is different. And I guess, me being the pretentious idiot that I am, I was like, wow, okay, I guess I appreciate game design now in a new way that I didn't before. Oh, wow, it's actually a creative act too. And it's like, all games are not just like shooter games, which like I still kind of am like, ugh, I don't like that kind of game. It just made me think of things in a whole different way. And I liked it. Moving along to my 3rd category, we have reached my most immersive book of the past probably several years. And that was, I mean, honestly, like no surprises here. This is so obvious, but The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. So let me explain why, though, I find this to be the most immersive book. It's quite a compelling story, about art theft, effectively, but like it's a beautiful study in the creation of place on a page. So when I read this book, it was earlier this year when I had officially and fully closed the door on the New York City chapter of my life, which came with a lot of emotions. And I was like actually kind of really quite sad to be leaving New York, even though I'd had a really complicated and difficult relationship with the city while I was there. But then I read this book, The Goldfinch, and much of it is set in New York, and it made me want to cry, basically, because it presented this view of New York that I just had never had in my real life. I was reading about this New York of like arts and creativity and just like these quirky characters who've been in the city forever, like who embody the city so completely. And I just was like, oh wow, like that is the New York I wish I had experienced, instead of like nonprofit hell New York. And then the book takes you on from New York City to Las Vegas, a place that I have never been to and have no interest in. But even reading about Las Vegas as Donna Tartt paints the scene, it becomes this like almost most mystical, mysterious land, this like almost like this very kitschy, kind of strange, otherworldly place. And it's like, it almost made me think, maybe I should go there. Like maybe it is an interesting city in and of itself, and it's not just casinos and like whatever. It just took me in completely and made me feel like, wow, like this is what reading is supposed to be. Reading is supposed to transport you, and this book does transport you. I think it is my favorite of Donna Tartt's books. I've read all three. I think she does do a very good job in general of like creating this immersive experience. I personally found this the most immersive of her three books. So take that as you will. On to my number 3. So this is a book, Happy Hour by Marlo Granados, that I mentioned in my Literary It Girls video, with, its author being often touted as one of the core Literary It Girls or an example of a Literary It Girl today. I don't know if she is. I think she did come out as a Literary It Girl in my assessment of who is and is not a Literary It Girl. But anyway, this book is, as the title would suggest, a book that just made me happy. I just enjoyed reading it, maybe kind of similarly to The Goldfinch, but also in a completely different execution. It was one of those books that presented a vision of New York City that it just enthralled me, wrapped me in the idea of what life in New York City could have been, but ultimately wasn't for me. This book follows 2 girls living in New York City, young women who are, I believe they have no right to work in New York City as non-US citizens, but it's kind of about them very scrappily finding their way towards having like fun and sometimes luxurious time in New York City. So it captures like the glamour, but also the almost like, hard scrabble, like, is that the word? Nature of life in the city, like just doing what you can to get by, like figuring it out as you go along. It's quite fun and exciting, and like they get invited to like all these parties, but also they have like money issues. And I think that it does kind of also bring this subversive element to the reading experience, which I found quite fun. Like I just found it to be a fun, enjoyable read. Another one that I'm like, I kind of wish I could have written something like that, but I don't know that I have the life experience. So I just really thought it was a good one. It was a good one. Now we're just on to like kind of, this was not one of my pre-planned categories. I threw this one in. It's just kind of a last minute addition because I'm like, might as well talk about what I have most recently read. And so the book I most recently read was The Interestings by Meg Wolitzer. I really enjoyed this. It was one I just picked up at a charity shop. I had read before The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer as well and really liked that. And so I thought, hey, why not pick up another by her? And it basically took the story of a group of friends who met at summer camp when they were, I think, 15, I believe it was. And it follows them through their lives, like to their 50s. And just like all of like their experiences, successes, failures, disappointments, it really like gets into the idea of what is success. Like, how do we understand conventional success? Like, does the ability to live like a life of creative production mean that you are successful? Are there other ways to live a successful life? I ate that up, obviously, because I'm very much like in that kind of phase of life right now where I'm thinking, oh wow, like what would it mean for me to be successful in life, as I've reached like a kind of impasse in my, what are we going to say, mid-30s? I suppose that's bleak. Early mid-30s though. Early mid-30s. Yeah. But having reached a kind of impasse in what I'm doing and what I want to do and where I want to go, I loved this. I loved this exploration of the paths life can take you. But what this book did that also was like so interesting to me from like a writer perspective or whatever, blah, 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 pretentious, was the way it kind of interwove time very seamlessly. So throughout this book, you're just moving back and forth through time. It's not very linear. the characters, you know, you'll jump to like them being teenagers to them being adults, and you know, and you just kind of see how life like intertwines on itself, and we're all the same people throughout, but we change. It was just I really appreciated how she did that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that one. I don't actually see that on a lot of lists of like books that you should read if you're a thought daughter or something. So I thought it was a really good read. I would definitely recommend it. And now we're on to like my what I would call required reading, and that is Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. Bullshit Jobs. Now this is, oh my God, this is like my foundational philosophical text. You know, I talked earlier about having a foundational text to guide you in life. Maybe this is mine. So a few years ago, I went through a phase of getting really cynical about the idea of work, specifically the idea of like 9 to 5 office work, chained to your desk, can't really get away from your computer for anything. And this work that you're doing, you don't understand why you're doing it. You went into the world hoping to make a contribution to society, but you found that you might not be. You probably are not. What you do does not serve a purpose, as it turns out. I read this book while I was working a job where like I was primarily tasked with getting grant money for an organization that I ultimately was coming to believe was not a force for net good in the world, might actually have been a force for net evil. And this book is all about that. It's all about the experience of doing one of these types of jobs, one of these very soul-sucking, like ultimately pointless jobs. And so I think it was like just so eye-opening to like know that, okay, like this thing I'm experiencing is an actual thing that other people have experienced. And it's valid enough that this professor, may he rest in peace, wrote a whole sociological text about it. But it's like not like dense sociology. It's very readable. It's very enjoyable. It's my required reading. I should really reread it very soon because I'm getting to a point again where I'm like very much questioning my relationship to work. And now we're on to what I would call my problematic fave, and that's a little life. Who makes videos about books? Who hasn't talked about a little life? I'm not going to be that person to break with that trend. So on the topic of a little life, when I read this book a few years ago for the first time, it was one of those books that like it made me want to drop everything and read it. Like I could not put it down. I never do this, by the way. Like I never really will like read for an entire day or something unless I'm really into a book. And this book delivered on that. I took a whole weekend where basically all I did was read A Little Life. Like I think I went outside to get some stuff from the grocery store and then I was just right back to reading. I was like, I need to know what happens. It is a book that presents you with 4 characters, and you start to like and get attached to these characters. And then such horrible stuff happens over the course of the book that I think you are pulled along thinking, oh, there just has to be hope. Like something's got to get better eventually because this is just too much. It's too much. And like, this is a common criticism I see of this book, and I completely agree with it. Like, I do think it takes the trauma a little too far. Like, I think it takes it to a point where it goes into the realm of unbelievability. And I've seen a quote from Hanya Yanagihara, the author, saying that she did that kind of intentionally, that she wanted to see how far she could push a character. She wanted to push a character to his limits, to which I just, like, when I read that, this is post reading the book, I was a little bit like, do I think that's a good thing to do? I don't think it's a good thing to do. That being said, though, I at once really enjoyed reading this book, but also I could have done with a different ending, and I could have done with there being kind of a lot more hope. Okay, and now, finally, we have reached the final installment of my nonsensical list of books. And this is like what I would say is probably my all-time favorite book. If someone asks me what's your favorite book, this is probably what I would say. And this one actually, again, might be a little surprising. This one does not appear on a lot of these lists of books to read. And yet I've read it several times and probably will read it several times again. And I think it shows me something new about the world every single time. And that is The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. This book is set in largely in Prague and around Europe. 1968 Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so first of all, we're starting off with this is a time period that I just am really interested in for honestly reasons I don't entirely understand, but I maybe do find these difficult times in history really fascinating and compelling or something. So it's set in that time, and it follows a set of characters, in their relationships, in their love lives, in their friendships. And this is also sticking true to the theme here, one of those books that is very philosophical while also telling a story. It asks a lot of questions about the nature of reality, about the nature of love, about the nature of life decisions, and whether we want to be weighed down, kept in place by our obligations, or whether we want to be weightless. That's what the title refers to. Weightless, without a lot of obligations, responsibilities. It's one of those books that throughout it really makes you ponder. It makes you ponder these philosophical questions without being too complex about them or too overbearing about them. It includes some beautiful metaphors. One of them is likening being an immigrant to walking a tightrope. And I'm yep. As an American in the UK, I can attest to that. Being an immigrant is exactly like walking a tightrope every single day. It's very exhausting. So just it makes those kind of apt social observations. And when I think about this book, though, of course, it's not a plot heavy book. It isn't even a book with super likable characters. It's one of those books where it's you really read it for the thought experience that it gives you. Thought daughter, indeed. And I think when I asked myself, okay, why does this get my top billing every time I think of my favorite books? And I think that what I'm realizing is that okay, so I read this book for the first time when I was 23. I think I read it again when I was about 25, 26. And now I'm reading it for a third time at 34. And I think that every time I am getting something different out of the experience. Every time it's asking me new questions about life and reality and my orientation to the world and to other people. And when I read it the first time, I was very engaged with the segments about new relationships and the beginning of love, because I was in that phase in my life at that point. And then as I go on, I think it's I'm getting into some of the heavier questions about life directions and trajectories and where we end up through the decisions that we make. And I think that it just feels like it's one of those books that for me, it's been growing with me. And so I just, I think it's my favorite. I don't know. I could change my mind. I mean, I think honestly, most of the books I have now in this very messy pile off to my side could be considered favorite books. I just think that it's Unbearable Lightness of Being, though, just does have a special place in my heart. Okay, so I guess that's a wrap. Those are my thoughts about several books that I have read and mostly enjoyed. I don't have a lot more to say about them. And I don't know if this was coherent. But now you know about my reading taste. And I suppose my advice to you would be to, go forth. And if you feel like reading, read. But if you don't, because reading should never be an obligation, as I have often found it to be these days in my life. So, cool.